I was thinking about that song that we were singing a while ago about God being the lifter of my head, and I thought, that never relates to me. You know, that's kind of a catchy phrase, I suppose, but it never really says anything. But that comes out of Psalm 3 in the King James Version of the Bible. It says, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of my head. Then he goes on to talk about how he cries out to the Lord. And that lifter up of the head business there in Psalm 3, I know that we sing that and sing about dignity and how, you know, we're all down and we've got our head down and God comes by and lifts our head up. But it's really even more extreme than that. Because what would happen after a battle, there would be all of these prisoners who'd be lined up there, and they would be groveling in the dust because they're about to die. And they know they're about to die, and if one of them in his bravery or whatever manages to look up and look his captors in the eye, they'd just beat the daylights out of him until finally he's down again with his face in the dust. And the king might walk by, and the king might extend his hand toward one of these prisoners and lift up his head and save his life. And that's really the idea behind that business in Psalm 3. Here I was ready to die. I mean, everything was wrong. My enemies are surrounding me. I don't have any hope. And then God comes, and God extends his hand to me and raises me up, and I have life. I'm going to be in trouble because I left my clicker down here. Hang on. We're going to look at Isaiah 6 this morning, if you want to turn there. Isaiah 6 is about the holiness of God. And I wonder, how do we connect with the holiness of God? That is so far removed from our experience. Holiness is just something that most of us are not. And we don't use that word very often. You know, we don't walk around out in the world talking about holy things, holy this or holy that. We may use it as, you know, in kind of an expletive way, but we don't talk about things being literally holy and what it means for something to be holy. But holiness is connected very closely to the idea of royalty. It's how you treat a king. And how many of you know how to treat a king? We don't do that. You know, we'd probably have to have a class on what do you do if the president happened to come to town. You know, you don't throw tomatoes and you don't throw cabbages and you don't do all the kind of stuff that a lot of us might try to do. Maybe the closest thing we get to being in the presence of royalty is the experience of one of my friends out in Arizona when she once went to an Elvis Presley concert in Phoenix. And she said, I screamed and I yelled, and, you know, it was almost a religious experience, almost worshiping Elvis on stage because he had that kind of persona. And finally, she said, I got thirsty. And so I left the auditorium to go find a Coke machine, and while I was walking in the concourse to find the Coke machine, Elvis sang his last song, and Elvis left the building. And she said, suddenly I looked up, and here comes Elvis down the hallway where I'm looking for a Coke machine. And she said, I was so excited. He was just an arm's length from me. And I said, then what happened? And she said, his bodyguard slammed me against the wall. Well, that's kind of the experience of royalty you get, that separateness. You don't get to just reach out and touch the king. You know, the king is protected from commoners. Maybe, anybody here ever met Queen Elizabeth? I'm going to get an audience one of these days where somebody says, I did, I met Queen Elizabeth. Then I can say, come up here and tell us what that was like. Because you probably, if you're going to meet the Queen of England, you probably will go through a long, tedious course by the U.S. State Department that guides you through and grills into you the idea of what you do when you're in the presence of royalty, even though she is not your queen. You bow or you curtsy when you're introduced, and heaven forbid that you would ever reach out and touch her, shake her hand, do all the things that we normally do as Americans, and you would never turn your back to her. There are just all of these protocols that we have because people are royalty. We just act differently in the presence of royalty. Now, Israel understood this. They knew Oriental monarchs pretty well. They knew that these monarchs were just a step below God. If they didn't claim to be God themselves, and they demanded that you treat them with great deference and with great dignity and treat them as the great holy people that they are, you crawled into their presence. You never looked them in the eye. You never addressed them in friendly ways. You addressed them with flowery, almost roundabout language so that they knew that they were greater than you are, and you knew they were greater. And there would be guards all around ready to strike you dead if you make the wrong move toward the king. The Egyptian Pharaoh sat on a throne, and on the back of the throne would come up and over the top a hooded cobra. And the idea is that the king is not in danger from the cobra, but you being in the presence of the king are in grave danger, because at any moment this cobra could strike out and kill you. And then the king would be surrounded in pictures, in art, he would be surrounded by these flying snakes. It's not just the snake that hides behind the throne, this huge snake, but it's these little snakes that are all around. And if you violate the dignity of that Pharaoh, then those little fiery snakes would come out and bite at you, and they would kill you. And the idea is that they protected the Pharaoh. These little fiery snakes, by the way, were called seraphs. The king is to be awe-inspiring. He is to be completely separate from ordinary human beings. He is to be held in the deepest respect and the deepest honor. That is part of what goes into this idea of holiness. And so now hear the experience of Isaiah whenever he finds himself in the presence of the holy God. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." We read it in the Bible, and we've read it so many times, probably we just kind of accept it the way that it is, but that is an eerie, astounding confrontation. I saw the Lord, Isaiah says, seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. The monarchs of Isaiah's day they're not like British monarchs or the monarchs that we see that wear long trains, and kind of drag their clothes behind them as they walk. But the kings would wear these tight-fitting skirts around their legs. And what he sees is the feet of God in the temple. And the feet of God are filling the temple. And the idea is that up above that is the rest of God. And he just kind of goes up and up and up and up. And there is this gargantuan being who is sitting on the throne in the temple. And you get the idea that God is really great. He is not just some man wandering around, the way that normal kings do, claiming to be someone great and trying to enforce the idea that he's someone great. This is somebody who is great and mighty. The Lord is great. The Lord is mighty. And around him fly the seraphs. Like I said, the seraphs fly around the Pharaoh to protect him. If you violate the dignity of the king, then these seraphs attack you. But notice that these seraphs that fly around the Lord are not attacking. They're not protecting anybody except themselves. They're covering their face, they're covering their feet, they're flying around, and they're crying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." And when they cry out, the doorposts and the thresholds are shaking. And I'm sure if Isaiah is standing in the threshold of the temple, he is scared to death because everything looks like it's about to come down. But the entire earth is cowering and trembling before the Lord. And the temple is filled with smoke, and nobody can look in there. God is not to be seen. God is not to be gazed upon. And Isaiah is just struck almost breathless with what? With terror? With despair? He cries out, "Woe to me, I am ruined." And Isaiah, who is caught in the presence of the Lord, knows that God is nothing like he has ever seen, nothing like he has ever imagined. And the idea smashes into him with almost pile driver force. You don't belong here, and you are unworthy even to mention the Lord's name. "I am ruined," he says, "for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." He commits a sin just by looking at the Lord. Isaiah is in the presence of the Holy One of Israel, the one who is so far above human beings, who is so completely different from humanity, from corrupted human beings. For human beings with their corrupted lips to speak of God is to do a real bad wrong. And to say even good things about him is to fall so far short of his true blessedness that it borders on blasphemy. And furthermore, to do what Isaiah has done is to actually lay eyes on the Lord in his holiness is not to be tolerated. It's not to be built up and inspired by his beauty. We hope we get to see the Lord. But Isaiah gets to see the Lord, and he is now scared to death because he realizes, "I don't belong here." Our malformed character kind of overwhelms us in comparison to the Holy One. He says, "I am ruined because I have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." I tell you what, if we understood what was going on in Isaiah 6, you wouldn't be sitting in those pews this morning. You'd be crawling underneath them, scared to death that God was actually going to be here, that something horrible is going to happen. We would hunker down. We would sneak out before the Lord actually notices that we are here. I mean, who are we that we would think we would be greater than Isaiah, this great prophet of God who has seen God, and it has absolutely terrified him to death? If we took seriously the holiness of the Lord, wouldn't we be too terrified to sit here this morning? Wouldn't we avoid the Lord instead of seeking him? I mean, we wouldn't dare. We'd kind of be like Isaiah. You know, here is Isaiah down front here, just lying in this little quivering puddle, and we would be right beside him. And then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Do you know what that means? I mean, this holy God, this separate, this unique, this holy other God, this God who is so far beyond us that we don't even deserve to be in his presence, whose holiness is so often thought of in terms of only judgment and fire and destruction, and whose holiness just dries up the heart of those people that find themselves in his presence. This holy God, one facet of his holiness is forgiveness. Sacrifice has been made, and Isaiah, utterly broken by his unworthiness at the foot of the Lord, hears words of forgiveness. So that the very next words out of his mouth are not, "I've got to get away, I've got to hide." But the very next word is, when the Lord says, "Whom shall I send?" Isaiah says, "Me." Instead of trying to hide from God, instead of trying to get away from God, now he comes into God to say, hey, it's me, I'll do it. I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his feet were nailed to a rough wooden stake, and his body extended up into the sky, and his arms were outspread and nailed to a splintery crossbar. And as he hangs dying, I hear the voice of Pilate saying, why? What evil has he done? This innocent one. And I fall at his feet, crushed by the weight of the sinfulness that so suddenly grips me when I see him and know who I am. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And I hear a rough, raspy voice speaking above my head. Father, forgive them. And I know that I am in the presence of a holy God. He waits for you to know his holiness, to fall before his feet, not in abject fear, but in repentant love that accepts what he has done for you in sending Jesus to the cross so that you might receive his forgiveness. We're going to stand and we're going to sing. If you need to come to Jesus, would you please come?
Oh, to be like